Now we're in section 7.3. What is the problem of ethnocentricity? Chapter 7, the relativity and ethnocentricity of human rights. Well, we've seen that Griffin wants to push that, disagreement and all these kinds of things over values is overblown, right? And he also, there's an optimistic, sort of an upbeat sense that what disagreement that there was, it's even toning down. And but we've seen previously that, even though there's disagreement, just because there's disagreement in a domain X, science or values or whatever, that doesn't mean there's no truth in the domain of X. But the problem of ethnocentricity is this. Well, just because, let's say we agree that there's truth in a domain, that's not, just because, well, put it this way, if we say that there's the existence of truth in a domain, that doesn't mean that everybody is going to agree on what it is, right? Even if people say, yeah, there's truth out there, but we're going to still disagreement. So we're going to still engage in things we disagree over, whatever. So the two, think of it this way. One is an ontological claim. That is there truth in the world, and is there a fact to the matter, and all that stuff. That's on the side of the world. That's like those are claims about the world. But when you talk about agreement, you're really talking about human psychology and cultural and sociological kinds of notions about what cultures happen to think and agree on and whatnot. So you're really in kind of two domains. It's not a surprise that they're logically separate, right? So you can have disagreement over there in amongst the cultures, and there's truth here in the world. Sure. And so there's truth here about morality. You can still have all kinds of disagreement about morality over on the cultural side of things. That's what this is getting at here. So even though you could have truth in terms of values, like what, there is a sense of high level objectivity, even dare I say a truth value when you say, oh, murder is wrong. You still could have disagreement over, not so much that one, but other things, about human behavior that one culture might think it's okay and another culture says no. But there might actually be an answer, like whether or not it's okay. So the point is that ethical relativism as a theory, right, saying that evaluating all moral judgments is a matter of pinning them to or looking them up on a chart of ethical frameworks and evaluating them with respect to a framework, and that's the only way you can do it. That is ethical relativism, and that may very well be false, and yet cultures still disagree. Like they still do, right? Even though you might be able to make the argument, it might really be the case that ethical relativism is false, yet cultures still disagree. That's really the notion of ethnocentricity now. Is just the disagreement is just still there, and how do you get and as thinkers on human rights, you have to take that as a problem. You can't just say, well, human rights really are objective. Well, you could, but think of what you're doing. You could say something like, well, look, it is the case that it's true, it's objective that moral judgments have truth values. Let's say you've argued that, you've established that, and maybe you and a couple of friends, yeah, you got that. And then, human rights are objective and they're universal. And let's say you get all that stuff going, yet cultures aren't listening to you. They're not taking you seriously. You can't universalize it in actual practice because other cultures are not agreeing. You've still got a problem, right? You're basically you might have made your case, but you did not really win the argument. So Griffin now is asking, how are you going to get agreement that's unforced, right? Think about it. Spreading morality and teaching morality is probably not something that you want to do by force, right? There's a deep and kind of tragic irony if you think you have a moral truth and you got to spread it through force. It's probably better if you don't. Those kinds of approaches to spreading morality tend not to work that well. Most people don't like being taught their morality in a rough way. Probably the best way to teach morality is in a very sort of pacifist kind of way, and rational argument, etc., etc. Okay, so that's what Griffin is basically after here. How can we get unforced, uncoerced agreement if we've established that you have objectivity here, but you're still not getting the agreement? How do you get the unforced one? Griffin says, let's start with one thing. Takes a lot of shots at Rawls in this book. But he says, look, let's get rid of something that Rawls said, and that many philosophers, and I've certainly heard this, and many people either know from reading Rawls or they picked it up somewhere. And we've seen Griffin's, let's not exaggerate. Let's not do like Rawls and have this notion of, oh yeah, in the international community, there's this radical pluralism of, cultures. They just see things so differently. And you're going to have to play Rawls's game about trying to construct, the well-ordered people's argument and all that, because things are so different. Griffin thinks that's something that's an old-fashioned kind of view, and there's really not a lot of good evidence for it. And things are, look at all the international agreements. Yeah, they're not perfect. Countries that sign them are not perfect, but there's more and more convergence on notions of human rights. Even if lots of countries don't exactly practice human rights perfectly, they have their exceptions. Well, Griffin says liberal democracies have them too. Here in Canada, it is possible to, you can put the brakes on certain things under certain circumstances, even on the Charter of Rights in Canada. So so by saying that, you can put the brakes on certain rights, what we've got is, as Griffin would say, is we got to get rid of myths about values and human rights. The myths in this sense are not myths like, oh, there is truth, and it's a myth that there's not a truth. No, the myth here is slightly different. It's a little more nuanced here. The myth is something like this. Probably many people who live in certain liberal democracies, maybe even Canada, think that they have inalienable, rights that cannot, under any circumstance, be taken away or violated or even infringed upon in any way. That there's sacrosanct rights. Legally, that's not true. As Griffin points out in a more general case, even liberal democracies, when there's a massive threat to the security of the state, rights can be suspended for not forever, not randomly. There are controls on it, but it's a myth to say that in a state pretty well anywhere on the planet, no matter how liberal democratic it is or whatever you want to say about it, that there are rights that absolutely the authorities cannot infringe upon. So that is Griffin saying that we can tone this all down if we start getting myths about the way rights are viewed, right? Get rid of that. That's a myth to think that you have absolute rights. There's no place that has absolute rights. So that's what Griffin wants to argue is a good place to start, by rejecting this Rawlsian radical pluralism. So all countries admit of some exceptions, and that's where the real discussions start of, well, what exceptions do we admit, and which ones do you admit, and how much of a difference is there with respect to our exceptions, and once we start that, how do we continue this convergence? How do we bring more people to tone down the ethnocentricity as Griffin wants us to do? He said, well, there's two ways, and if you recall in chapter 1, section 5, he went into this in more detail. But basically, there was one way that he thought was a little more ethnocentric, but he thought it would work a little better, and one way that's a little less ethnocentric. It's sort of just the continued spread of these Western-originated ideas of HR to move around, the globe. This notion of not absolutely prioritizing, but laying a heavy emphasis on the autonomy of the individual, and that we're all equivalent, we're all equal moral agents. So this protected normativity, this normative agents status, that's what human rights, we should work to spread that more around the world, and that getting other cultures and what to elevate this view of the normative agent. He thinks that this is probably the more of an ethnocentric approach, but he thinks this will probably have the best consequences in the end. He said the other one, instead of the spread argument, it would be look for equivalencies in other traditions. So, and scholars do this a lot. It's called comparative philosophy. Looking for, oh, do other traditions have these ideas as well? And lots of times you can find them, but Griffin thinks that that's going to be a problem because it could lead to more or less just sort of identifying kinds of names and saying, well, we have a name for that too, or we have a name that's similar to your name, but it may not be exactly have the same content. So he thinks this will be more of a surface endeavor. But again, Griffin wants to get away from Rawls's contractualism, Rawls's notion of, we have to, have this sort of bare minimum human rights thing. And if you recall, Rawls's list of, sort of the agreed upon human rights would be much less than Griffin's, and far less than the UDHR's notion of human rights. Griffin thinks, of course, that's inflated, but he said, that we're kind of stuck with a lot of these notions of human rights, that Rawls's program for this agreement would just leave us with, bare bones kinds of human rights, like like sovereignty of nations and things like that, just in terms of war and intervention. He thinks that we can ground human rights on this, this sort of dignity of the subject, like it is in the UDHR, and that won't necessarily lead us into ethnocentric views, because we can get an unforced agreement on that. So this can be developed further. And it's interesting, this discussion ends on where he thinks the biggest cultural divide is, and he says it's largely between liberal democracies and India, which is an interesting discussion. You can have a look at that. It's very debatable whether he's right there, but it's important to see what he's trying to do. And so you can disagree. You can maybe say, no, that's not where the biggest gap is, or the biggest division. But I would say you read it in this kind of spirit, that what Griffin wants to do to drive home that the differences are exaggerated is he picks what he thinks the largest difference is. He thinks it's located between the West and India, not the West and China, but the West and India. So he that's what he thinks. Okay, let's say he's right about that. And so he's saying something like, well, if that's the greatest difference, now let's look at the convergence between the West and India. So with the greatest difference, let's see the convergence. Well, he says, look, it's the biggest difference, and yet it has a great amount of convergence. So by his argument says, well, things with smaller differences are going to probably have at least, if not more, convergence than the two of the biggest divergence. So it's a spread the net out wide, get everything in it, and you can pull the drawstring in. So the biggest difference is between the West and India, and they're converging. So then other differences are going to be probably even closer or lessened as well. So in sum, he's really, what he's trying to say is that a lot of these differences are overblown, and the biggest difference can be overcome with respect to HR, to thinking about HR. And so, it's a very optimistic, upbeat note that even the biggest differences show evidence of being bridged. See you next video.